Talks, part of the Oakland Good movement, where we interview an exceptional Oaklander doing important work in the Oakland community. I am super excited to speak to our guest today. His 2012 documentary, The Waiting Room, received the Independent Spirit Truer Than Fiction Award, the Golden Gate Award, and the Audience Award from the San Francisco International Film Festival. His new film, The Force, goes into an Oakland police department trying to regain trust with its community in the midst of scandal and a national landscape wary of those who are sworn to protect. The Force had its premiere at the 2017 Sundance Film Festival before making rounds at the Independent Film Festival in Boston, the San Francisco International Film Festival, and many, many more. The film has already received the Courage in Cinema Prize, the Bay Area Documentary Award, and a Directing Award for U.S. Documentary from none other than the Sundance Film Festival. And I had the great fortune of seeing this film the other night, and I thought it was really excellent. It's bold, it's compelling, it's even cinematic at times. I'm super excited for audience to see the work of a filmmaker who I think is really, really at the top of his game. As fearless as a storyteller as they come, I am, of course, talking about Pete Nix. So, Pete, hey, thank you so much for doing this, man. I know you're a busy guy, so I'm so grateful to you. It's got a lot going on. So, Pete, the first question I want to ask is, I just want to ask about your relationship to Oakland. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up outside of Boston, about 26 miles west of the city, and
doesn't everybody?
Yeah, everybody, right where the Boston Marathon starts,
That's
actually.
Right, yeah.
And but I think I'm coming up on having lived and then I left when I was about 18 for DC. Went to college at Howard in DC, and lived there for about 11 years, and I'm coming up on my 17 or 18 year anniversary here in the Bay Area. So this is my second home now. My wife and I and two kids live here. I went to Cal. Went to study documentary film at Cal with John Else, who's when he joined the program. That's why I wanted to come out here. He's a sort of legendary in the documentary world, and I was just I've always been struck by Oakland's personality, the history of the city, the active community in the city. So much has happened here. So much of what we're talking about nationally is happening locally here, whether you're talking about access to health care, criminal justice system, education, housing, gentrification, all those matters that we're debating on a national level happen in a visceral way right here. And so as a storyteller, it struck me several years ago when I started my nonprofit that we could tell a series, make a series of films telling that grand narrative of one American city. And so that's what sort of loosely inspired by The Wire in Baltimore. That's what I set out to do when we began with The Waiting Room.
Awesome. That's actually a really great segue into my next question, which is, did you grow up in a family or a community that really embraced storytelling, specifically through filmmaking? Or how did filmmaking find you, or how did you find filmmaking?
I think I had a family of storytellers, artists, musicians. My Uncle Paul and Uncle John were sort of legendary jazz musicians in Boston. I grew up in the black church, and so you hear lots of stories on Sundays. At the 3+ hour church services. My dad was very active in the civil rights movement. He went to school with Martin Luther King, and so I grew up with these narratives about the African American experience, about sort of the pursuit of justice, the pursuit of social justice, in a city that had a complicated relationship with the African American community, Boston, with busing. And my mom was one of the few black school teachers in the Boston public school system. So I grew up, surrounded by all that, and but it's a different flavor than sort of the dynamic that exists here in Oakland. But I kind of came into learning about this city with that sort of with that background.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So filmmaking is obviously not a medium you can rush. There's so much that goes into it, particularly with documentaries where events happen over a long span of time. Mm-hmm. There's oftentimes in-depth research that's required. So in other words, it's a serious investment of your time, obviously, and money. So how do you decide which story needs to be told? I mean, what's your thought process?
I come to it in a combination of an organic fashion that if you think about the agency of a community, the ecosystem of how a community gets its strength, its agency, you're looking at access, access to resources, access to justice, access to healthcare, all those things. And so I knew that I wanted to examine that question through the perspective of these public institutions that provide those services, whether it's public health or education, housing, and ultimately criminal justice. So I knew the grand framework was there. In terms of where we began, it was a little bit of a serendipitous thing. My wife happened to work at Highland Hospital, and I've been wanting to make a film about Highland for years because of the stories that she would come home and tell me about this community, about the relationship between the community and this hospital, which I found to be very unique and special. The struggle that the caregivers, went through on a day-to-day to provide care for that community, and the relationship that formed because of that, the bond, I felt was, ripe for storytelling. But I just never knew exactly how to approach this big institution. It's very complicated. And I've always been a big fan of Frederick Wiseman's work and sort of examining institutions. And I felt, maybe there's an opportunity to sort of update this, modernize this idea at a moment when this was back in 2007 was really the spark of that film, when there was a great national debate about healthcare, and one that had become very divisive. And it just so happened that I came home one day and Vaughn was like, "Hey, they're making a documentary about Highland," and I was like, "Oh man, I missed my chance." If you don't act, you miss your chance. Turns out that the directors, Rob Epstein and Jeffrey Friedman, were friends of mine. Jeffrey had edited my first film, and so I called them up. And at this point, I had been a producer for a bunch of years, working at ABC in New York, and had a bunch of films behind my belt. And I asked them if they needed any help, and they needed a field producer, someone who could shoot, and I shoot. And it was, in some ways, a step back in my career, but I thought about it, and I had so much passion about wanting the story to be told that I agreed to come on board. And then for a variety of reasons, the least of which was that they got financing for a narrative project that they've been trying to get off the ground called Howl, which was about Allen Ginsberg.
That's right.
The project kind of went off the rails, and then and it was funded. They had been approached by two investors, Bill Hirsch and Scott Vergis, who are two local attorneys here who really believe in the power of nonfiction to sort of move the needle on public policy issues. And I approached Rob and Jeff and Bill and Scott, and I said I'd like to take over the project, because at this point we had done about 6 months of research. I'd shot 100 hours or so footage around the hospital, meeting patients, meeting caregivers, and all that material was just burned into my mind and my soul, and I felt this story has so much potential. And so I approached them all and I said, "Hey, if you let me take over the project, I'll raise the money myself." And that was in 2009, and the rest is history.
Yeah.
And that really sort of put everything in motion. I started a nonprofit, Openhood, to be the framework for that. I conceived of the idea to not just do one film, but to do a series of films examining the city, the community, and the issues.
What was their diagnosis that they discharged him with?
He was just shot. That's all they said. I mean, but he's going numb now. So on them papers, on the instruction papers, it states if you're going numb, fatigue, or any of that, they're in my car to come right back to emergency. We're here and nobody is doing anything.
Being that it's an emergency department, we don't take people in based on when they arrive. Just because you get here first doesn't mean that you go back first. People with more emergent or urgent situations go back to an emergency department first. There's people that have been out here waiting for a really long time. The emergency department is completely full. The beds in the department in the hospital are full, so nobody moves. So unfortunately, it's not just you guys. There's people coming in from the ambulance as well.
I'm wondering, Pete, when you set out on a project, do you think this is the message I want audiences to take away, or is it more? Do you let the message, if any, sort of reveal itself on its own, if that makes sense? Do you have a sense of what you want audiences to think after walking away from one of your films?
I mean, fundamentally, I want audiences to feel. I want audiences to be moved emotionally. I want them to question themselves in the world around them through the complexity of character and through the complexity of what the challenges that we face, both individually, morally, internally, and the challenges that institutions have to face. But institutions are made up of human beings.
Sure.
And so I've always believed that in the complexity of life, there is meaning. And I have a deep respect and value for filmmakers, whether they want to call themselves activist filmmakers or filmmakers with a point of view who have sharper edges to their sort of approach in terms of directing you to a argument.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really take that approach with my storytelling process. I want to immerse you in an environment to let you really feel and understand what it's like to be without health insurance and have to rely on the waiting room as your primary care physician, to be a cop, facing extremely complex situations day to day, to be a member of the community that doesn't trust the police, that has a history and a narrative that underlies that distrust, so that we're challenging everyone involved to sort of reframe and think about themselves a little bit differently, because I just worry that sometimes we drift too closely toward these single narratives where we're sort of that create division. Not that we don't need to fight for our values and fight for what we believe in, but there are deeper conversations that need to be taking place right now in this country, and through that complexity, that's how we're trying to frame the experience for the audience, so that after the film we can create conversations. And this is where the idea of openhood comes in as a sort of community organization, is we want to, as we're building this group of films, that we're also going to be creating frameworks for having community events around these films, discussions, putting them into curriculum in schools, partnering with nonprofits to keep the conversation going.
I see. So I do obviously want to talk about the force. So we are dealing with an embattled police department that's been under federal oversight for, I believe, 13 years. Obviously egregious misconduct and pretty much a revolving door of police chiefs. I think anyone who sees this film, the first thing they're going to wonder is, how on earth did Pete convince the city of Oakland to allow him access to the Oakland Police Department? Can you talk a little bit about that and what that process was like?
Getting access to, it was hard to get access to Highland Hospital, because what hospital administrator wants a filmmaking crew coming in showing how stacked and backed up the waiting room is? Similarly with the police, we felt we were going to face stiff resistance to us coming in, but surprisingly, we found that they wanted to tell their story, and this was a department that a lot of people didn't realize, that this was a department really on the cusp of progressive reforms. Not because necessarily they woke up one morning and said, we want to do that, but they were forced to do it. After the 2000 riders scandal, where officers were, there's a judgment, a legal judgment against officers who were violating the civil rights of people in the community, that they were trying to, it was a situation where a bunch of cops were tasked with dealing with some of the more violent members of the community, and they violated their civil rights in the process, saying, we're going to, we have to do this in order to do what you're asking us to do, which is to control them and to keep this community safe from these folks. But they took it too far, and they were placed under federal watch, and because of that, the department was forced to reform. In the process, they began really sort of checking off a bunch of boxes. Use of force, numbers went down. Officer-involved shootings were down. They were one of the first departments in the country to use body-worn cameras. The chief, Sean Went, who was brought in at the time, became a poster child for reform, was traveling all over the country, speaking about what the OPD was doing. And so they wanted that story to be told. They didn't feel like that was being told, that sort of the view of the police was being flattened out into two-dimensional narrative on people's Facebook feeds. And so that's part of the reason why they let us in. And we told them, we said, we're coming in here with eyes without judgment, but we're not making a commercial about this department either. We're going to tell it like we see it, and we're going to humanize you. Humanizing doesn't necessarily mean we're going to make you look good, but we're going to unpack, who you are, what this department is in a full 3 dimensions, and that was sort of the contract, that the understanding that we embarked on this what became a very dramatic adventure.
One police officer can affect the credibility of a department, of a city. One police officer can have an impact on this whole country.
This police department has a history that we have to own up to. It's our legacy. I don't want bad cops here, period. I don't need them. They can go.
This is the 4th shooting in 2 months by the Oakland Police Department of black men.
We don't know the story. Don't nobody know the story. What happened? What's going on?
Puritanism, 1922.
Panicking under pressure will get you dead. You get one chance to get it right.
I think one of the many great things about your films is the way you humanize people. You also beautifully show the diversity of this city, which is great. So in the waiting room, I think you do a wonderful job of dispelling the notion that, oh, that couldn't happen to me.
Yeah.
That, I'm beyond getting laid off.
Yeah.
I'm beyond losing my health insurance. I'm beyond, having a health problem. And then in the Force, you really humanize these characters that we often envision as, oh, that guy with the badge and gun that I can't relate to. But some of the cops and the police officers in your documentary, they don't even look old enough to shave.
Yeah.
I mean, so for me,
Yeah.
Is that a conscious effort on your part to show your subjects in a light that makes them relatable? That do you want us to walk away saying, gosh, that could have been me, or I'm kind of like that guy?
And sort of going back to your original question about sort of commitment and time that you spend. I mean, part of what we do, the value proposition of what Openhood does is commits, to really trying to understand the people, the places, through months, if not years, of development and research, and sort of spending time before the camera even rolls to try to understand people, so that when we do start to make decisions on how we're going to represent, people within the Oakland Police Department, for instance, officers, command staff, that we have a firm understanding ourselves of who they are. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, character is not revealed until a crisis.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
People speak about that, and that's sort of our process. Is by the time we're in the edit room making decisions on how we represent people, we have a sort of a competency, a capacity for what we believe the truth to be. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times what's revealed is unpredictable and incontrovertible, in terms of the things that happened in this film led to a certain place that are undeniable. And all we had to do was show up and show what happened. And so, but that is something that we take very seriously, which is really trying to understand and go beyond the stereotypes, both of who a cop is, who a protester is, who a Oaklander is, and try to present and reframe for people beyond the stereotypes who these people really are.
Well, and I think that's a good point. You referenced The Wire, and I think one of the reasons why a lot of people proclaim that show is the greatest show ever made is because they showed everybody's perspective.
Yeah.
And they humanized everybody.
Yeah. And you flip. One of the great things about The Wire is that you can see humanity in a drug dealer and in a politician and in a teacher in a way that completely turns your perception of who you thought they were on its head. And that is something that is a profound reality in any city as complex as Oakland, where the story of sort of race and equity and sort of is so deeply woven into the fabric of the city, going all the way back to the Panthers and now evolving into Black Lives Matter, which started here in Oakland.
Yeah. So Pete, I wanted to ask you, although you tackle some difficult issues, obviously, that maybe don't always show Oakland's best side, quote unquote, but I have to say I still get the sense that your films are in a way sort of a love letter to Oakland. to a community that you care about. To me, it's almost like you're saying, I love you, Oakland, now get it together. I don't know if that's presumptuous, but is it safe to say that's part of what drives you to tell stories that take place here? Or is it more that it's more that you use Oakland as a jumping off point to raise issues that all cities across the country are grappling with? Is it the waiting room and the force? Are those issues that just happen to take place in Oakland rather than our Oakland stories? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think the analogy is an apt one. And you know, I'm a dad, and I have 2 kids, and I love them very much. But you know, there are moments when you need to be firm and where you need to discipline them. And if we didn't discipline them, they wouldn't feel like we cared about them. And I think, you know, from a storytelling perspective, it's subtle and it's sometimes unspoken, but my overarching theme or sort of belief is in the city and the optimism of the city. It's a remarkable place, and it reflects in so many ways what we want our country to be, you know, the diversity, but it also has all those challenges, you know, with that diversity, with economic advancement and technology comes gentrification, comes housing, and now we find ourselves in a city where people can't afford to live, or where you have strife between the community and the police. Those things need to be confronted head on, and with an optimism that requires the telling of difficult truths. And from my point of view, you can hold both of those things side by side. You know, the love for the city and revealing the beauty of the city on the one hand, on the other hand, holding that city and its institutions and the individuals, the leaders within that city to account.
Pete, it's my understanding that you completed the force and then the big scandal hit.
Yeah.
Which necessitated the need for further shoots and further edits.
Yep.
You look exhausted just talking about it. Why did you feel the need to change the film? And just from a logistical standpoint, I mean, how do you go about diving back in, raising the extra money? I mean, what's that process like?
We had some tremendous funders on board. Cinereach was one of our funders, and they were remarkable in terms, and Sundance also was a tremendous partner in really helping us sort of bring resources at a moment where we faced our own kind of internal crisis, which is what do we do now that the story has shifted, and we were actually about to go to the Sundance Edit Lab when all this happened. We had to cancel our trip to the Sundance Edit Lab. Nobody does that, you know. But Sundance was incredibly supportive. Cinereach was incredibly supportive, and they provided us with additional resources to sort of, you know, go back in and do some additional editing. We felt we could not ignore the story. It was an international story. It spoke, you know, almost in an oblique way to the original story that we were telling, which was a little bit more geared toward the matter of sort of race, and you know the question that Black Lives Matter was raising around sort of profiling and use of force as it related to the African American community. And this was the scandal involving sort of a moral failure and an abuse of power. You know, officers having sex with an underage prostitute that, you know, thematically, you know, challenged us in terms of how does this relate to the story that we've been telling. So we had to sort of figure that out. The framework for the film ultimately became, this was a 2-year period that we followed the department as they were actively trying to reform amidst the rise of Black Lives Matter, a sort of social movement demanding accountability and change within our police departments. And so ultimately, it was completely relevant to the conversation around sort of, you know, how does an institution operate within a community that's asking it to change? You know, and what are the pressure points within an institution that cause it to fail? You know, is it a toxic macho thing? Is it a moral failure that's always going to be with us? You know, these are sort of questions. Is it a spiritual thing, almost a religious thing, that we all have the capacity to sin? You know, so a lot of those things were a little subtle from the end, where you saw sort of religious imagery and, you know, questions, and there's also Shakespearean sort of quality to the film, and that Shakespearean question of the sort of universality of the failures that can happen within an institution, within an individual. We live in a constant cycle of failure and reform in humanity. So we wanted to raise some of those more sort of deeper, profound questions as well.
You did a wonderful job doing that. The film The Force allowed you pretty unprecedented access to the life of an Oakland police officer, and at times at least it appeared that you could have potentially been in harm's way. And I wonder how you decide what risks are worth taking in order to take a story. Do you have sort of a bold versus reckless barometer in your head? I mean, how do you determine I need to do that?
I mean, being a documentary filmmaker is such a strange thing sometimes because it's like, you know, tragic or dangerous or horrific things are going to make your film more, are going to make people pay attention, are going to sort of speak to and get to the heart of the matter. And so for us, it's not like we wanted bad things to happen, but on some level we needed bad things to happen because we needed to see how officers dealt with the crisis, how they dealt with a violent situation. We were always cognizant of the fact that anything could happen. You know, we got into some pretty hairy situations. I think one of the first ride-alongs we were in, we almost got into a head-on collision.
Wow.
You know, and I'm sitting there in the front seat with the camera. I don't have my seatbelt on. You know, and I was thinking to myself, wow, this is this worth it? Like, what am I doing here? But I think every journalist or photographer, particularly ones that operate in conflict zones, whether it's war or sort of with the police, there's always the potential for conflict. You start to get very focused on just your frame, and I shoot my own films, and so there is a bit of a detachment from reality that can be dangerous. And so I was constantly questioning that, and I've got 2 kids, a wife, you know, friends and family who love me, and you know, ultimately, you know, I have a job to do, but I also, you know, want to keep myself safe, and so that was something that, you know, was always there.
Last 3 questions, Pete, that I like to ask every Oakland Good guest. What do you think is the greatest misconception about Oakland?
That it's a violent city. I think I hear that all the time, and I think, you know, it's because, you know, it's the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads. People happen, and that's what was so conflicting about this story. Not that we set out to say, hey, we're going to tell a story about the OPD, and you're going to see how, you know, crime-free Oakland. We knew that you know, seeing Oakland through the cop's eyes was going to show you a very challenged view of Oakland, but it's a component of the city. You know, the people who commit violent crimes is a relatively small number. The analogy I like to give is like, you know, war on drugs is driven by a very small number of hardcore drug users. A tiny group of people consume the vast amount of drugs in this country and drive the drug war. Recreational users, which is the vast majority of drug users, you know, they don't consume that many drugs, right? It's the same in any big city like Oakland, Baltimore, New York, Cleveland. There's this perception that that's the totality of the community, and it's such a two-dimensional rendering of the city. And we were hoping to kind of break that out, and we tried in various ways to do that with this film, to show the diversity that, you know, it's not just Black Lives Matter, you know, Black people in Oakland are a diverse group, politicians are diverse, the people working on to make the city a better place are an incredibly interesting group of people. And so, you know, that's why it's also not just one film. It's this series of films that's, you know, in the end going to tell a very deep story of who makes up the fabric of this city.
Next question is, what do you love about Oakland?
I mean, I love its diversity. I love its energy. I love its social engagement. It's so unique in that way. It causes challenges as well, but I think it's a city with an identity, and it's a city with a vibrancy that is just surprising. And you can turn a corner and, you know, see street art, or you can see music at the Fox, or, you know, you see the sports culture here. You know, I'm from Boston, so we have a big sports culture in Boston. And those ideas of frameworks where people come together, and that's why the waiting room is so beautiful for me, because the waiting room represents this idea of people from all different places coming together and be bound by a shared experience. You see that at like an Oakland A's game too. And so for me, storytelling represents that idea of figuring out a way to frame and bring people together to share an experience, to remind us of how we're different, but we're a community at the same time.
I love it. Pete, last question. What do you hope for Oakland?
I hope for continued engagement in these very real questions that we have about equity and about what makes a city great. And I think we're seeing some tremendous challenges right now in terms of trust between community and police. We're seeing tremendous challenges in housing, in gentrification. And I hear so many times people say, oh, it's over. Oakland's done. It's gentrified out. It's changed. And I think we can't accept that. We have to continue talking about what it means to create and sustain the evolution of the city in a way that's healthy for everyone. And that's why, stories, documentaries, dialogue is an important part of that process.
Yeah. Pete Nix, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, that is it, everyone. Thanks so much for everybody that's watching. Please make sure you go out and see The Force. It is really an excellent piece of filmmaking and very, very timely. It opens on September 15th at the Landmark Embarcadero in San Francisco. I love that theater. The Landmark California in Berkeley. And then, of course, right here in Oakland at the Grand Lake Theater. Until next time, I am Nick Macron reminding Oakland to be good and do good.